So mine's going to be the shortest talk, I think. I'll be touching on a lot of the things that you've already heard on a very high level. It's fantastic that Christina and Malcolm have gone into such great detail of a lot of the things that that the CMS does deal with. But basically, so I've already been introduced, but I'm Hillary Warner. I'm Senior Data Manager for Entomology at the Natural History Museum. I'm going to talk about how we store and use this georeference data in our CMS, as well as some of those limitations and other considerations we have with that particular type of data. Next slide, please. So this is just a high-level agenda of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start very, very generally about what a CMS is, my specific role when it comes to the CMS, and then I'm going to dip back into our very specific CMS that works for the Natural History Museum and where the georeference data sits within that data ecosystem. Then I'm going to talk about how we get that data in and how we get the data out and the considerations we have to think about when we are publishing that data. Next slide, please. So, what is a CMS? And if everybody knows, I'm sorry. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry, Christina. Thank you. All right, so when I talk about CMS at the Natural History Museum, I'm talking very specifically about a collection management system. The collection management system is a subcategory of a content management system. Now, content management systems are ubiquitous through any kind of organization that actually uses and cares about their data. So they all have a certain thing in common, and in common with our CMS, but any kind of place that is storing and using data as an organization, it is going to be specialized software. It's not Excel, it's not Access. It is specialized software that it can be cloud-based or you download it, but you log in and then you have a user interface that will guide you through entering the data in a useful way, in a useful structure, so that data can be queried and used for whatever the goal for that institution is. It is centralized repository, so therefore many, many users are all accessing the same software to contribute to the same database, the common database, and it's considered the single source of truth. So as I said, you might have Excel spreadsheets and Access databases, Post-it notes that have information that's relevant to your institution scattered around the place. But if somebody came to the organization and asked a question, they're not going to go and look for your Excel spreadsheets or your Post-it notes. They're going to open this particular specialized software, and whatever they query, what comes back, that's the answer. So we do, going back to one of the questions, we do temporarily hold information in Excel templates before we ingest them into the system, but it doesn't really count until it gets to me and I get to put it into the system. They're also audited, so particularly our institution has to be very transparent. So while you can modify and delete records, every save, every modification, every delete is actually held in our uneditable audit module, so that if there's a Freedom of Information Act, we can always go and get the data out and see all of the changes that have happened. So when we delete records, we're not hiding anything. It is just simply for the users to clear out things that aren't useful on a day-to-day basis. But everything is audited and kept in this content management system that is our collection management system. The other thing that they all have in common is they are secure. So you usually have to have a login and certain permissions granted to you. Depending on your role, your access to the system will be different. So some individuals might only need to look at data and not actually do anything with it other than see it and use it for their own purposes. Or you might need edit rights, or maybe you only have to insert, but you don't, in your particular role, you shouldn't be modifying anything. So you can have a type of access that only allows you to make new records, or you could be an administrator with full access, which is what I am, which leads us to the next slide, please. Thank you. So my role, that's many years ago when I had red hair. I am a system administrator, I'm a data manager, but one of the things I do is provide that level of access to the system. So for instance, if you come to me and say, hey, I need access to the collection management system, I'll say, cool. What do you need it for? Like, well, I'm working for a week with a curator, taking pictures of specimens, and they want me to attach the specimens to those records. And I'll go, okay, you don't need access to the entire system to do that. We can come up with other solutions that don't actually require you to have edit rights to the full system. And we'll set you up with that. We'll make sure you can do your job. Likewise, you might come to me and say, hey, I need access to the collection management system. I'm like, cool, why? at which point, if they say, I am the new senior curator for this particular organism, like, all right, you're getting read-only access right away. We're going to find time where we can sit down for an initial 2 hours and go through basic training on the system. Then I'll give you edit access, and then we'll meet up in 2 weeks to a month, see how you're getting on, cover any specific questions you have, etc. And in the meantime, I'm here to support you, which goes to the next bullet point. I am the point of contact, as well as some of the other data managers, for any kind of questions, advice on how to use the system, as well as when error messages show up or it's not behaving the way that they expect, then we are the first point of contact to sit and actually troubleshoot through exactly what's going on with the software and get it working for them. Likewise, if in the process of their using the system, we actually find a genuine gap in its capabilities or structure, if there is a field that's missing that is truly required, then we are not software developers, but we do write the specifications that we then send to the suppliers, and then in the next upgrade, that will be implemented to meet the needs of our curators. We also do certain harmonization, basic data cleaning. We won't go into that. I think what Malcolm and Christina have covered. They do a lot more of the data improvements than us, but we'll do sort of lookup lists with the curators. Like if we got a dirty lookup list, come to us, tell us what the list should look like. We'll harmonize that. We'll lock it down once it's clean. But we also harmonize the fields. So for instance, if we find out that the fish curators and the entomologists are holding this exact same kind of data in 2 different fields, then again, we'll write that specification for the suppliers, and that will be harmonized and dealt with in the next upgrade. We also develop our internal data standards, and we also provide the reports for DCMS, the Department of Digital Culture and Media Sport, which I believe has actually changed now, but that's what it was until recently. We also produce the reports, the schedule reports for the curators if they have certain key performance indicators, KPIs that they want to see on a regular annual or quarterly basis, and reports for the trustees. So we handle the scheduled the reports for the data out. Anyways, so that would be to the next slide, please. Okay, so specifically our collection management system. Our collection management system is geared towards cataloging our objects, but it handles all the processes and not everything that's required for managing those objects once they're cataloged. We don't just catalog them, put them in there, and then, okay, cool, we've got a list. Those digital objects are used to track all of our information about our acquisition, whether or not these items are registered. These have legal implications. Do we own them? Are there other constraints because it's been bound to the British Museums Act? That all has to be in the CMS for us to understand. It manages our loans, our exhibitions. It also handles all of the location control and movement history. So the CMS tells us, where is the object meant to reside permanently in our collection stores? Where is it right now? And where has it been in the past? That all is in the collection management system. It also holds all the condition reporting. So if an item is damaged and goes through conservation and is repaired, that goes into reports in the CMS. Our pest monitoring data also goes into our CMS, and it can actually produce heat maps of the actual building, giving us a temporal idea of exactly where something might be starting to become a problem before it becomes an actual problem for the collection itself. So we can catch emerging pest problems really quickly using the CMS data. And it has the object use history. So for instance, a specimen might get dissected, a slide's then made of part of that specimen. It becomes a new cataloged object with its own movement history, its own storage information. DNA extractions might be taken, and these child items are all hung together within this collection management system. So we have a certain level of object use history. There are other object uses that we would like to capture that we haven't quite necessarily begun doing in terms of sort of external uses, like what the research. We can attach some research to the objects. It's not necessarily done in a standard fashion as of yet. But more importantly, we're going to the collection event data, which is what we're talking about here, is the georeference and the sites data, in which case we'll go to the next slide. All right. So now we're going to talk about getting the data into the system. So we're going to talk about the collection events. And if we go to the next slide. So the first thing you need to know about the way that we structure our data in that system is the sites data is held in its own box, and the object data is held in its own box. So we have to make a decision for each of the attributes that we're collecting that's relating to a collection event, whether or not it's considered a site attribute, or if it is an object attribute. So going through a few examples, trap type. Well, traps move around. That's going to go on the object, because it's not actually, even if you have a site that you use a specific trap at on a regular basis, it's not actually part of that site. So that's going to go on that cataloging object record. Elevation, well, the elevation is unlikely to change very quickly over time. It's fairly permanent unless there's a landslide. That's, for the most part, we'll go, yeah, that is on our sites data. That is considered a site attribute. Habitat, sometimes a tricky one, but habitat is something that does change incredibly rapidly. So therefore, just you wouldn't make a site record for an area and say, I'm a rainforest, because the next year you go back to that site and you find out it's now a palm oil plantation. So because of that incredibly rapid temporal change of the aspect of a habitat related to a spot on the Earth, we don't consider that sites data. That is also on that object record with the collection of the other collection event data. Exhibition name, object, verbatim locality. That is also on the object as well, because we consider that basically label data, and that label is effectively a part of that specimen. And that is what is then used to be interpreted as Christina's talk and Malcolm's talk covered, that object data, when you're sitting there looking at the label and the transcription, if you're lucky, somebody's actually photographed the label and it is on that object record, then you can sit down and start building your site by interpreting that into the site's module. And that is obviously where the coordinate and the mapping data goes. That is definitely sites, in which case we'll go to the next slide. So now that we're in the sites module, and we're only talking about sites data, I'm going to talk about how we atomize, validate, and the kind of restrictions we've put in place and the level of flexibility we have in our CMS. So it's highly atomized. If we can split the data up, we do. So a field for every single concept as much as possible. We have some free text fields for good reasons, but if you can split that data up and put it into a categorized field, that's what we want you to do. We also, as Malcolm alluded to, saying, we have X number of objects, but probably only 3 million sites. We're trying to reduce the number of semantic duplicates. So we have uniqueness checks based on a certain number of fields. If all those fields all match any other records in the system, and a user's trying to make a new site that has all that matching data, it will ping back a little error message going, we think that there's probably a site that's in the system already that probably will meet your needs. Please cancel this, go back, put those search terms in, and see if there's not something you can already use. So that's one way that we try to stop too many duplicate records getting into the system. We also have field type restrictions, particularly locked lookup lists. And this will come into play later in terms of the terms that we allow users to place into the sites module. So for instance, for country, the system is not going to let you put in UK. It will not let you put in U.K. It will not let you put in U.K. You will have to be using that locked lookup list to add United Kingdom spelled out. Likewise, if there is a genuine missing term, the only way to get that term into the system would be to contact me or one of my colleagues, and we will verify that that's an acceptable term that is missing from the system, at which point we will add that to that locked lookup list for use. In terms of flexibility, it does allow, as you were talking about to Malcolm, one of the questions was about the previous data, the less precise data. The system does allow those multiple interpretations to all be kept on that site. So if you are looking at a object record and it has a site attached, and you follow through to that site attachment and you see somebody, it will have the attribution on the lat long. So it'll say, Hillary Warner in 2024, georeference this using Google Maps. she's with this level of probability that it's somewhere within this radius, and it's a massive radius. And you go in and like, well, I actually have more specific knowledge on this, as Christina said. If it's somebody like Christina, she looks at the label and go, I can completely interpret this in a completely different way with all of my specialist knowledge about geography and history of collectors. And she'll go, okay, actually, Christina Lahoyna, later on that year, 2025, using something else potentially, has it with a very, very precise location. It's like, this is what we're using now. But that builds up in a nested table in our sites module. So it does have the facilities to have not only the history, as Malcolm compared it to the history of determinations that we use with our specimens identifications. It basically gives you the facility of having a history of interpretation for a site. It also allows you to just simply have different interpretations using different services, but making it very clear what you're using to make those interpretations of that site's data. In terms of publishing, though, you have to say which of those rows is the preferred row for what's going to then go out onto our data portal, because I do not think our data portal surfaced the entire table. But we'll get to publishing and data out soon. But as I just explained, in terms of explaining how those multiple interpretations are entered into our CMS, it does take in uncertainty, radius, geometry, datum. All of those fields are available for you to describe how you got to your decision as much as you possibly can. It also has supports for grid mapping data. So if you are of a group who tends to use OS maps and things like that, they have additional facilities to handle grid refs in the various different styles and formats. And again, it has the facility to let you tell them exactly what you used, what sources you used to determine your grid refs. Now, if you could go to the next slide, please. So we started to hit a little bit on those limitations, and we've all talked about one of the biggest problems is those temporal changes. Our sites module does not have a field for relevant time range. It's not like this site is relevant from this year to this year. There's no way of actually capturing the relevant time other than the fact that it's then associated with an object. So it's the object being associated with it that gives the collection date. So at the moment, to deal with the changing boundaries and the changing names, we simply have standard advice to the curators. And our standard advice is historical and colloquial names are to be held on the sites, on the object's record, either as a note or a verbatim capture. And then you are meant to interpret what the current accepted name for that particular location is. And that's what you use for those controlled drop downs that we have for country and state and district. So you have to interpret to what it is today. One of the biggest problems with that is today is not a snapshot. We haven't stopped changing borders. Politics haven't stopped changing borders and names. Everything is still changing. And in order to then, after a specimen has gone through that process and gotten a really good georeference site, the georeferencing is great. So if you have coordinates, that solves so much. Again, georeferencing solves so much. If you have taken the time to really put a dot on the planet, then we can cope with updating that really easily by using some of those mapping facilities that Malcolm's talked about. Those can effectively, we can put in shape files that have the common, the current name, and we could do that on a regular basis and then align, but we don't actually force the users to put coordinate data in. So if they've just taken the time to get the modern interpretation of the terms, then we have a real problem with figuring out how to update the terminologies that's going to be searched on. So this is why good georeferencing is so important, because we effectively went through quite a lot of work to try and harmonize all those terms, lock them down so that we didn't have all of those duplicates based on the U.K, U.K. United Kingdom. We put a lot of work in trying to remove that duplication out, lock it down. But now without georeferencing, where borders have gone from being quite precise to then being merged into a really large area. If we were to change the terminology without the georeferencing, we lose precision that we have based on how precise that term, what it represented at the time of doing that work. And if we change it, update it to match, because it's now in the center of a very large, district, when it used to be a tiny district, then we've actually lost some information. So georeferencing does solve so much when it comes to that sort of issue in terms of trying to keep terminology aligned within our sites module. So interoperability, if you have specific coordinates, I love when people just give me coordinates, because we don't want duplicates to go in. So if somebody gives me data where they say I need new sites added to these new objects in a template, and they haven't given me coordinates, I am going to have, the system's going to come back when I try to import that going, we found 500 possible matches. Which one would you like to use for every single one? And that's it. That's why we normally say, don't do that. Either go make your site first and then give me the internal record number that I can associate, so I just know this record to this record, or go and find the matches for me beforehand and give me those internal record numbers so I can match and match, or georeference it, because quite honestly, if you do a good job georeferencing your data that you're handing me right now, those coordinates are unlikely to match. And I think that's okay. What we want are good maps, more so than making sure that everybody's using the exact same record, with an exception. When it comes to those general site records, we do have standard countries and regions. They are provided as a group that you can actually pull back from the CMS, and they're all listed so that somebody who's like, I've got a label that just says China, they know which China record is that record. The other way that we make it very clear for those standard countries and regions is they do have centroids and radius associated with them to make it very clear. And this is very useful for the users when they're in the system and they are trying to make those matches, or give me the IRNs and template to pick those records. Like, this is very obvious. It says centroid has been centroid calculated by Malcolm Penn is one of the notes that we have to make it clear that it's a big shapefile. We also have tagged it with the word master. We've put it in the list, so we can then all share a single general record for China or the UK. And those are used a lot in our DCP workflows so that we can get that high level, not very specific record associated with the specimen, so that there's something available for the end users before somebody can go and actually associate with a much more precise location, if it's possible to get a more precise location on those specimens. Next slide, please. Okay. And that leads us to data out and what we have to consider when we're publishing. So next slide, please. So one of the first things we just talked about were those centroids, those master general areas. So while I said that there is a really good reason for having that in the collection management system, we have issues when we then publish that out, because those centroids tend to look like they're just in the very center of Australia. And then we get people contacting us going, why do you have so many flying fish in the center of Australia? And quite honestly, the benefit of that really broad centroid in publishing has not seemed very helpful. For the most part, you don't need, as an end user on our portal side of our externally published side, to be told where Australia is. Those levels, probably the georeferencing is not that helpful when it comes to the mapping in that particular situation. So what we do in those cases is we actually just hide the georeference. If it's at a certain level, we'll hide the georeferencing data from the publication. Not because we're hiding that information. Anybody can always contact a natural history museum or us and ask for additional information, and we will report it out, provided that's what's required. Again, we're open as default, so if they're not publishing something, it's for a good reason, or just a practical reason. So we also think about the usage. So there's a lot of predictable usage, which Malcolm's covered in great detail. Research, as he said, changing distributions of species across time and across the planet. historical considerations, people who want to study particular collectors as well as particular expeditions. So we kind of know that we're trying to get the data to facilitate those uses, but they're also unpredictable uses. Certainly from my curatorial background, I know that our objects have been used by artists in all kinds of interesting ways. I had people come in to photograph insect cuticles in order to make fake CG beetles for a Super Bowl commercial. So things that you're not really expecting your items to be used for. Now, what would be an unpredictable use? I don't know, for georeferencing data. There's a chance that Banksy could send us an anonymous donation of material that, when georeferenced, sends a poignant message on a map. It's probably not gonna, but you never know. So we just want our data to be as flexible and as usable as possible for as many audiences as we possibly can. Next slide, please. So whilst we do want our data to be as usable for as many audiences as possible, there are some sensitivities to be considered and some risks. So first off, simply with those lock lookup lists, the terms that we are approving to use in the system and publish out, you can inadvertently make a political statement that you weren't meaning to make. Simply using the name of a particular country could imply that you align with a regime, and that is not obviously the goal whatsoever with what we do at the Natural History Museum. We are simply trying to do, advance research and science. So we do still need to have a term associated with the record. People can't look at coordinates, even though coordinates are fantastic. You can't look at a coordinate and I can't go, oh, I know exactly where that is, and then I can decide what that place should be called. So we need to align these to some sort of terminology. And the way to stay neutral and non-political is that we don't make an in-house list. We haven't made our lookup lists ourselves. We are using ISO standard countries and regions. If it has an ISO abbreviation, then that term will be available in our collection management system. And below that, we use a free external resource to apply terminology, which is GADM. And I have forgotten, I should have put the abbreviation, what that stands for. It's like geodatic. I'll look it up for you if you want to know. But yes, it's an externally free resource that provides shapefiles and mapping services. That's where we get our terminology from, just to stay completely neutral. If somebody does, and it does happen, come to us and say, why are you calling this place this? Then we could say very clearly, because this, not because we're making any statement of our own. It's just because these are the standards that we're using. And if those standards change, we'll change the system. So the other thing that's a bit more obvious for a natural history museum is not wanting to, whilst we want as many people to be able to use our data as possible, we don't necessarily want to encourage poaching or species loss. That's the last thing we'd like to do. So it's a bit of a tricky one because our species list is not sensitive. Do we have rhino? Yes, we have rhino. Have we collected things from Africa? Yes, here's a map. Here's all the places in Africa that we have material associated with. It's only when you do associate that rhino with that spot that you're potentially causing a problem in terms of a very critically endangered species being highlighted of, hey, here it is, there's where you go. This is down to the curators. Basically, if a curator says, I'm very concerned about the possibility that this combination of data is going to be very problematic for this incredibly critically endangered species, I don't think is appropriate, then we have an open exception policy. So that basically there are a number of reasons that we will let people remove specimens from publication. And if they say this, I really think that this needs to be removed. In this case, we can't just hide the georeferencing data. We have to take down the whole specimen because that site data when the rhino was collected, they might have also collected, parasites, grasses, soils, all from the same space that was related to that same site record. And we have no sensitivities. The grass, the parasites, the insects, the soils being associated with that spot on the planet, that's not sensitive, and it might be incredibly useful to other disciplines. So in this case, we can't just hide the georeferencing data, or we'll lose so many benefits in those other groups. We just have to hide this whole catalog record itself. But again, if somebody, it's not because we're hiding anything. If a mammologist, there we go, mammologist, contacted us and said, hey, I work in conservation, and we know they work in conservation, they're like, it's going to be critical to saving the species for us to get this georeference data associated with your collections, we'll absolutely hand that over. But then you have that due diligence behind the data being passed over to a specific individual who is known, who's using it for a known reason. So again, we're never hiding anything on purpose. We're just trying to do our best, as we all do. And last, not least, but just complicated, just throwing it out there, is while we do atomize as much of the data out and control it as much as we do, once we get past that district, county, shire level of controlled terms, we then have a free text field that allows you to better describe the site at a more precise level, which is why it's called our precise location. But because it is a free text field, there's not a whole lot of policing that we can do. So this is where, when we were talking about the verbatim location, that stays on the object. This is a place where you can put something that's close to verbatim. It's not what it's for. It's for an interpretation of actually taking that hierarchy and then breaking it down in a controlled way in the precise locality field. But as I said, with a free text field, there's no policing it. So one of the things that can come up every now and then is with changing laws and laws in other countries. So when we first made all of this data, loads of it will have gone in before we had GDPR. But now that we do have GDPR, there's a chance that somebody might have said, oh, I had a friend who lived in the neighborhood. He liked collecting rocks. He collected rocks off my property. I had no clue he was going to then donate it to the Natural History Museum. And he's described it as my name and my address in the precise locality field. So these things can happen when you have free text data, and you have to be aware of it. And again, this is a situation where if somebody were to say, I'm not comfortable with the way that this site's described, I think it highlights who I am and where I live, and I don't like it. Again, there'd be no question. That would be something that we'd take down. But again, we'd have to take down that catalog record, because it's not inappropriate to be in the collection management system. It's incredibly useful to be in our secure, locked down collection management system. There's a lot of data that can be in the collection management system that's just not appropriate to be out in the wider world for one reason or another. But that's pretty much me. And I will now say thank you, if you go to the next slide. And then we want to break or questions.
Thanks so much, Hillary. That was brilliant. And yeah, you make a really good point about definitely not wanting to share where the last few of a species is, for sure. Or certainly not very widely in the public field. Yeah. You have just a comment that somebody really enjoyed it, and the condition reporting and pest monitoring feature was really interesting. I also think that's really interesting, the way you can do heat maps of your stores. That would be the dream. And the specifics of data management that you went through. So thanks so much. Guys, we might just go for lunch, and sure, we'll be having the kind of general discussion and chat and stuff after that. So we can all get into the nitty gritty then. Yeah. It's 12:46, so we'll come back at 1:45, 1:45, and we'll get started on the afternoon session. Is that all right? Okay. Thanks a million, everyone.